Hello, GW political junkies, and welcome to the last episode of Capital Crossfire for this semester. I'm Jessica Nix. As we enter the summer, the coronavirus pandemic is still present, but there is some hopeful news. Vaccinations are continuing to increase as over 200 million people in the United States have received at least one dose of a vaccine. President Biden will reach his 100 days mark on April 30th. So far, his presidency is marked by the administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic and the American Rescue Plan, which was the legislation that provided aid to Americans and to businesses. Biden presented an infrastructure plan, which he hopes will continue to be negotiated this summer. In his address to Congress, Biden proposed a $1.8 trillion plan that includes universal preschool program and 2 years free of community college. The progress through the last 100 days is also marked by an increase in migrants on the southern border and an increase in gun violence. Climate is another focus of his first 100 days. Biden started his presidency re-entering the Paris Climate Accords, which was a campaign promise. Biden pledged to curb 50% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, which sets up the steps for zero net carbon emissions in the U.S. by 2050. Earlier in April, the White House virtually hosted world leaders to discuss the climate, and leaders from Japan, Brazil, and Canada made new climate promises. The debate over DC statehood has made its way to the floor of House of Representatives. With a 216 to 208 vote straight down party lines, the nation's capital is the closest it's ever come to becoming a state. In a thinly held Senate, more liberal Democrats are hoping to win over centrist Republicans and some centrist Democrats who have expressed concern for DC statehood to pass the 60-vote threshold the statehood advocates need to reach. In Russia, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has ended his hunger strike. Navalny was arrested in February as he re-entered the country after being poisoned. On March 31st, Navalny started his hunger strike as a resistance to state-sponsored medical care, insisting that he needed an independent doctor. Navalny's arrest has inspired countless protests across the country. Aside from Navalny, Russia is in the news for pulling back troops from the Ukrainian border after sending large amounts earlier this year. President Biden did speak to the Russian president earlier in April about the United States' support for Ukrainian sovereignty. And with that introduction, let's dive in and meet our debaters. On the left, Patrick Healy, a junior majoring in political science and minoring in public policy. Patrick is the Deputy Director for Economic Justice for the GW College Democrats and was a field organizer for the Biden campaign. Patrick is broadcasting from Richmond, Virginia. On the right, Quentin Burrian, a sophomore majoring in political science. Quentin served as the intern coordinator on Representative Young Kim's campaign. Quentin is broadcasting from his hometown in Center Moriches, New York. Thank you both for joining me tonight. First up, we're going to start with something a little close to home. Washington, D.C. statehood has passed the House and it is headed to the Senate. The Biden administration supports statehood, but some centrist Democrats like Mark Kelly of Arizona and Joe Manchin of West Virginia are not fully on board. For D.C. to become a state, the bill has to pass a 60-vote threshold, which seems like a big feat in this narrowly held Senate. Advocates for statehood point to DC's population of 700,000, which is more than the state of Wyoming, and the lack of federal representation as to why statehood is needed. DC does have a say in presidential elections with 3 electoral votes thanks to the 23rd Amendment, but no vote in the Senate or in the House. If DC were to become a state, the 23rd Amendment, which says the district is treated like a state for the sole purpose of presidential elections, would have to be undone by another amendment, which is another lengthy process. Opponents to statehood point to the Constitution, which says Congress will be the seat of a district that does not exceed 10 square miles. The House bill sneaks around this provision by shrinking the federal district to the center around main government buildings and the National Mall. Many Republicans oppose statehood because DC swings heavily blue, so Democrats would get 2 seats in the Senate. Some advocates for statehood have said that DC's lack of statehood has been a historical effort to disenfranchise Black voters in the area. Quentin, we're going to give the first question to you. Opponents of DC statehood have cited the section of the Constitution that says the U.S. Capitol should not be a state, and constitutionality is becoming a primary argument against statehood, while supporters of statehood are saying this argument is a thinly veiled attempt at disenfranchising Black voters. What is the strategy for Republicans to keep centrist Democrats from voting for statehood? And on the other side, how can Democrats change their strategy to win back centrist Democrats and some centrist Republicans?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I mean, rightly, as you pointed out, this recent bill, H.R. 51, suffers from a grave misunderstanding of the Constitution. So ultimately, I think if we want to persuade our fellow representatives to vote for a bill, we're going to have to take it back to a very traditional model. You're going to have to slow this process down. You're going to have to really debate and get these questions on the Senate floor, because ultimately, right, this is nothing more, unfortunately, than a brazen attempt to gain 2 Senate seats in an area that votes heavily blue in every presidential election. You know, if we're gonna, you know, if we want to, you know, make progress here, we're gonna have to actually discuss that and not simply racialize the issue, because you know, ultimately, if it's a case that we're disenfranchising Black voters, well, who are those Black voters going to vote for in a blue state? I think that's a bit of a disingenuous argument, because it kind of blows a hole in the fact that this area votes one way. It's not disenfranchising Republican voters. So, you know, I disagree with that argument. I think this is a last-ditch attempt to get some legislation passed while the House has a majority and while the Senate still maintains its bare majority. And I think ultimately, though, if we're going to want to get something passed here, to answer your question, that we're going to have to work it back. We're going to have to get debate going, and again, not criticize the use of the filibuster as well, and ultimately kind of take it back to square one of how Congress is supposed to function, in a long form, in a drawn out debate where the best issues are presented forward. And, you know, this cannot be solved simply by, you know, in 2 years. I don't think it's simply possible in that manner.
Patrick, I'm going to give you the same question. What's next for DC statehood, and what's next for the strategy on both sides of the argument?
Well, the whole premise of the debate is, on the Democratic side, is that we believe that every American should have representation in Congress. DC residents pay the highest taxes of any place in the entire country, yet they don't get to decide where their tax dollars go. DC got $700 million less than any other place in the country because it doesn't have statehood under the coronavirus relief bills passed in 2020. This is about making sure that we have a strong local government for the people of the District of Columbia, and as we should support anywhere in the country. For Democrats, the next thing we need to focus on is making that case to the people, because every American should be able to vote and have representation in Congress. And we believe that these efforts to oppose that or to retrocede DC into Maryland just doesn't recognize the distinct issues that face the people of DC. The people of DC face different problems from people in Virginia, where I am, or people in Maryland. DC has a lot more problems when it comes to issues such as education, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to racial equity. There are a lot of different issues that need to be addressed that the DC government, including Mayor Bowser, have said they need more power to address. Also, another reason is it's also in the best interest of the federal government, because as we saw on January 6th, the reason the insurrection got as bad as it was because the District of Columbia did not have the authority to dispatch its National Guard. If it were a state, it would have had the power to do that, and the insurrection would have been a lot less bloody, and arguably no one would be dead because of it. So Democrats need to get out there and make the case. This is also about security, it's about equity, and it's about fairness for all Americans.
President Biden has officially been in office for 100 days. So what's been accomplished and what is yet to be accomplished? Vaccine rollout is a success, with over 200 million doses being administered by this 100-day mark. Huge price tags are attached to legislation like the American Rescue Plan and Biden's proposed infrastructure plan. Climate is also a big focus of the administration. On day one, Biden re-entered the Paris Climate Accords and canceled the Keystone Pipeline. Both were campaign promises. He has pledged to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and he held a climate summit with world leaders this month. Patrick, we're going to go to you first for this one. Looking specifically at Biden's climate actions, how does the US stack up internationally, and can more be done domestically for climate change?
Well, first, to answer the second part of your question, yes, absolutely more can be done domestically, and it's reassuring to see the Biden administration moving in that direction. President Biden has changed our fortunes very quickly on where we stand on climate action. Just before he took office, the US was the laughingstock of the world when it came to climate change. We were going backwards instead of forwards, including having a president who said that climate change isn't real, even though 99% of scientists say it's real. Now here, President Biden just hosted a climate summit, as has been mentioned prior in this program. And since then, President Putin in Russia, President Bolsonaro down in Brazil, as well as President Xi Jinping, as well as many European leaders from our allies in the UK, as well as our allies up in Canada, have announced initiatives, in some cases doubling their ambition for their climate goals and their greenhouse gas reduction targets for the next decade. The U.S. announcement from President Biden that we are going to cut our carbon emissions in half by the year 2030 is the key reason for doing that. When America shows leadership, the world is willing to follow us. So I think that a lot has been accomplished, but President Biden domestically has already made some very ambitious promises. His infrastructure plan wants to build 500,000 new electric vehicle charging stations. That makes it palatable for every American to own an electric vehicle, and it brings down the cost of electric vehicles as well in the long term. He's also signed executive orders and put in place policies that allow us to double energy production from offshore wind, most of which will create jobs right here at home in America. So it's not just good for the environment, it's also good for our economy. So President Biden has made a lot of stride, and I look forward to watching him do more.
Quentin, your response. Where does the U.S. stand internationally on climate change policy, and what more can be done domestically?
Well, I mean, simply put, the U.S. is a world leader in carbon reductions. We can be fed that narrative from the Biden administration, but it's simply not true. We've been reducing emissions since the beginning of the Trump administration without being in the Paris Climate Accords, because ultimately they don't do anything. So long as the Chinese continue to laugh in our faces as they pollute the earth, it doesn't frankly matter what agreements we sign into to appear on the world stage as a climate leader. We're reducing our emissions, and that's not unfortunately, that is fortunately a undeniable fact. So whether or not we want to admit that and continue to live in an administration where the debate is hijacked by Senator Markey and Ocasio-Cortez, who want to pass the Green New Deal. Ultimately, we have to be real with ourselves. We're never going to solve the climate crisis that way. It's going to come in two ways. One is dealing with China, first of all, because they are the world's leader in pollution, and they also dump the most plastic into the ocean. And two, it's going to come through the new bipartisan bills sponsored by House Dems and House Republicans and lobbied by the ACC to promote nuclear energy bills, carbon capture bills. I agree with electric charging stations. Ultimately, we can't just spend our way out of this issue. We do have to create industry-based solutions as well. And I welcome the Biden administration to promote those bipartisan bills that are coming out of the House now, because ultimately that is the greatest path forward. It's not going to be joining the Paris Climate Accords, which does not hold the world's polluters to account. It only holds the world's reducer in pollution to account.
So continuing with President Biden, his approval numbers have come out reaching this 100-day mark. On average, Biden's approval sits about 54%, which is lower than most modern presidents, but higher than President Trump. According to Gallup's polling, Biden has a 96% approval rating among Democrats and a 10% approval rating among Republicans, which is a huge gap. So Quentin, Trump campaigns on saving many blue-collar jobs like coal mining rather than turning to renewable energy. Now Biden is in office with these lofty climate goals. So how can Biden tailor his political strategy to accomplish these goals and start winning some Republican support in the polls? Is it, like you said, by putting in infrastructure plans and making it more job-centered as he's starting to kind of market his infrastructure plan?
Frankly, yes. I mean, we cannot unemploy our coal miners and expect them to be able to find a job because we've spent $1 trillion on it. Ultimately, right, as I mentioned before, if Biden wants to get popular with Republicans on climate change, he has to embrace the bipartisan climate bills that are coming out of the House, because they are job creating and they're going to reduce our emissions even further than we already are. Nuclear is a huge part of that. There's a lot of skepticism among the left and the right about nuclear power, and ultimately we have to just start to dispel that skepticism. It is incredibly powerful in its energy production and is incredibly clean in its emissions. So, and that's a lot of jobs right there. There's a lot of jobs, I agree, in solar manufacturing, but we have to I agree, infrastructure is going to be a part of that. It's going to be finding a way to employ our coal miners. It is true that solar power has eclipsed coal as a major producer of energy in the United States. So we're already moving in that direction, which is very good. Ultimately, I believe, though, it's not going to be the government that phases out coal mining jobs. It's going to be the market reacting to the economic benefits to being in green energy. And that's what the Biden administration has to tailor its approach to putting free market capitalism, working with green energy to produce viable jobs and viable solutions that not only make us a world leader in an economic sense, but also make us a world leader and continue to be a world leader in climate reduction emissions.
Patrick, your response. What does the Biden administration do next to be able to close this partisan gap in his approval ratings?
Well, I first think that some of it is out of his control, since considering the last president refused to even acknowledge that the election was fair. So I think that some of it is just totally out of his control. But I think that on climate, President Biden has already started laying the foundations for a bipartisan response. As my opponent said, look, carbon capture, nuclear energy are very important pillars of that. President Biden, in several press releases, as well as in speeches and in other public forums, has endorsed the idea of carbon capture. He wants to put more money into research and development for that as part of the infrastructure plan that he's pushing right now. He's also endorsed the idea of more nuclear energy, because nuclear energy has a lot of potential to be a source to help us reach carbon neutral electricity generation by 2035, as President Biden has set out in his ambitious targets. And those are things that are going to save lots of energy jobs. Plus, jobs in nuclear energy pay more than they do for fossil fuels or in renewable energy. So obviously, it's a worthwhile pursuit as well. It's good for jobs and it's good for the environment. So I definitely think that that is a palatable alternative, and I think Biden will get out as soon as he can and try to sell that as much to the American people. Another thing that President Biden can do, though, to close this gap is he just needs to get out there. His speech tonight outlining all of these priorities is one way he's going to do that, and explain why we're doing all these things and how it's not going to hurt people. Carbon capture saves jobs in fossil fuels otherwise would probably go away. My opponent also mentioned that we need to allow the market to decide this. I couldn't agree more, and that's why I think that President Biden's proposal to possibly get rid of fossil fuel subsidies is important, because it allows the market to decide what is the best way forward on determining our energy future, instead of just having a bunch of companies that are no longer profitable held up by the government.
Let's end our discussion with Russia. Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny returned to Russia in February after recovering from being poisoned. He was immediately arrested, and protests have erupted across the country. Navalny was assigned a state doctor provided by the prison, and in protest, he began his hunger strike at the end of March. Navalny was on the brink of death before a request for an independent doctor was filled. Russia has pulled back troops from Ukraine's border after escalating tensions. President Biden spoke to President Vladimir Putin about the United States supporting Ukraine's sovereignty in early April. Biden also placed an emphasis on the U.S. no longer, quote, rolling over in the face of Russia's aggressive actions, including interfering in elections, cyber attacks, or poisoning citizens. Sanctions from the United States were imposed on Russian officials who were involved in chemical and biological weapon production. Patrick, we're going to go to you first. Is Biden being tough enough on Russia? Are Biden's rhetoric and sanctions alone enough, or how should the foreign policy approach change?
Well, I think we need to wait and see what happens, because President Biden has just now started this more aggressive posture towards Russia. I hope we can all agree that poisoning citizens is unacceptable behavior of any world power. let alone one with the influence of Russia. The Alexei Navalny situation is despicable, and it should not be allowed by an open liberal democracy such as the United States. I think that these sanctions are a step in the right direction, as well as the expulsion of several Russian diplomats as well, because the attacks in the 2016 election and the attacks in every election since, and even maybe previous elections, are direct attacks on American sovereignty, and that cannot stand. I hope that President Biden continues this tough stance, and if Putin does not step back and recognize that he needs to stay in his own lane and allow America to have its own political trajectory unimpeded by Russia, then other options might have to be considered, including bringing in European partners to cancel the Nord Stream gas pipeline that's about to benefit the Russian economy massively. I hope we don't have to get to that point, but America's sovereignty cannot be messed with.
Quentin, we're going to give you the last word. What should change with Biden's foreign policy, or is what he's doing enough?
Well, I mean, as Patrick rightly pointed out, KGB-esque poisonings of party leaders within your own country is patently unacceptable. And I agree as well that canceling that pipeline may be a necessary step. I'm not necessarily a fan of dramatic intervention like that, only because I think we deal enough with the Russians that America as a nation should be looking not necessarily to be absent on the world stage, but to be cognizant of our influence within other nations, because we get mad when it happens to us, but we're very happy to do it to others. But on another point, with regards to Biden's foreign policy, I think one of the ways that we stay tough on Russia is through an economic link. That includes partly by keeping things like the Keystone Pipeline alive and keeping America a net exporter of energy. Why? Because when the world buys their energy from us and not from the Russians, that is a direct economic benefit to us, and it's a free market sanction. We don't have to. It's not a punishment. It's a very fact of how we trade on the world stage. So, ultimately, if I agree, we need to be tough on the Russians, but we can be tough on them by squeezing them out of the market, by remaining energy exporters, as opposed to more direct intervention with the Europeans, which is, I would love, if we had more time, I would love to hash that point out with Patrick, because he makes good points. But ultimately, that is where more I stand. I think America is better served being tough on Russia through an economic lane, not necessarily through a more interventionist lane, only because of how history has showed the fails and successes of that. So generally, that's where I stand on the matter.
And with that, we finish up our last debate of the semester. Patrick Healy, Quentin Burian, thank you both for joining me tonight. I'm glad we could reach a couple points of consensus. To everyone at home watching, remember to check out GW-TV on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and on our website, gw-tv.com. For everyone at GW-TV, I'm Jessica Nix. Have a great summer, get vaccinated, and we will see you in the fall. Thanks for getting caught in the crossfire with us.